With each release, Ubisoft dig their hole a little deeper. But no matter what happens in the future, no matter how much more they slip, they will always have these three franchises, or at least the glory days of these franchises. They have made so many great games and created their fair share of unique IPs, but these three are undoubtedly their greatest, best, and most well known. For many, Ubisoft started going downhill in 2014 with the release of Watch Dogs and Assassin's Creed Unity, but for me, I think it was 2016. Their games lost their individuality, they started trying to please everyone, and in the process ended up pleasing no one, making Watch Dogs 2 the exact opposite of the original because of the backlash. Making Assassin's Creed an RPG were decisions that made me stop loving their games. Watch Dogs 1 was the first time I was genuinely hyped before the release of a game, looking up every new bit of information. For almost 2 years, they kept delaying it, and it was even looked at as their GTA 5 killer. Unbelievable visuals, hacking that looked cooler than it ever has, an open world that was going to ruin every other open world. When those are the expectations, there's literally no place to go but down. And the game started off the generation of overhyped and under-delivering games. People think Cyberpunk was hyped, but Watch Dogs was just on another level of hype. That infamous E3 demo that I have probably watched over 100 times, the game did seem like something we had never seen before, and it came out and everyone, literally everyone hated it. The game was ripped to shreds. 3 days later, I picked the game up, played it on a somewhat medium-end PC, so it's pretty much being the worst version of the worst version of the game. But surprise, surprise, I loved it. I finished it in record time, only to go back and finish almost every side quest. Gang hideouts were my personal favorite. A very basic idea, but I could play around with the awesome combat system in place, so I absolutely loved doing them. In the 8 years since, every time I have gone back, I have thoroughly enjoyed the game. Now it looks pretty dated. It looked pretty dated in 2014 for many, but I didn't think it looked particularly bad, but now it does show its age and more. But the actual game was great in my opinion. Combat was outstanding. I absolutely loved the way Aiden moved. The setting was perfect for the type of game it was. The plot was alright, cars were terrible, and it looked average. That pretty much sums it up. 2.5 years later, the sequel came out and I was once again excited beyond belief. But it just didn't feel that good. The game just felt vanilla. Ubisoft pretty much created a game that was a mix of what everyone wanted instead of going with their own vision. It felt like they took polls on the different aspects of the game and just mixed the winners up, hoping everyone likes it. Marcus is the ideal example for that. He is the polar opposite of Aiden. Personality, looks, everything. He's a goofball that cracks jokes every other sentence, which was the big complaint about Aiden. He was apparently an empty trench coat in terms of personality. Many of the gameplay elements carried over, some were even improved. Hacking especially is much better in the sequel. The original was bare bones. Hacking was a very tiny part of the game, especially when you consider how heavily that aspect was marketed. Watch Dogs 2 is a fun game that you will enjoy, but it just feels so ordinary that it isn't all that memorable. One thing they did nail down was the game world. This will be a common theme in this video. Ubisoft are just masters at creating or recreating places. Everything from that point on is questionable at best, but the world building is just insane. I mean, Rockstar are known for creating expansive worlds with incredible attention to detail. A game like RDR2 beats every Ubisoft game, well, at everything, but more importantly the game world. But it is kind of close, and more importantly, Rockstar release a game every few years. Ubisoft release a few games every year. In 2020, they released Legion, Valhalla, and Immortals Phoenix Rising in the span of a month. It is actually impressive how they come up with impressive worlds every year. In 2019, we got our first look at Legion, and it was different. The game is set in the near future, which is a nice change. They didn't go too far in the future, which was probably the right move. The E3 premiere focused on the play as anyone option, which I'm not a fan of at all. It always felt like a gimmick that took pressure off Ubisoft in regards to crafting a compelling story. A AAA game made to be played for dozens of hours really does need a story, or at least a semblance of a plot, or else it's going to take a miracle for anyone to finish the entire thing. Playing as a granny is cool for about 5 minutes, but when the game is 50 hours long, you are well and truly screwed. Some feel each game in the series has progressively gotten better, but I have always felt they got worse with each new installment. Legion is even wackier, drones flying around, a dystopian future. I can see why this game is loved. I did have fun because once again exploration was fun, combat was great, it was very different from the first two. So for a while I found the game to be enjoyable, but replaying it is a chore. The series had so much potential, but they did mangle it over the years. But the original is one of my favorite games of all time. Assassin's Creed, perhaps one of the most well-known game franchises in the world, has had quite a journey, from being loved to hated to getting no emotional response at all. Over the last 15 years, Ubisoft have released a lot of Assassin's Creeds with varying levels of success. It all started back in 2007 when an idea for a Prince of Persia game became the phenomenon we now know as Assassin's Creed. The first game is probably one of the underrated entries in the series. It is labeled as being repetitive, broken, messy, dated, or even downright boring. But the thing is, when someone talks about Assassin's Creed, one of the first things that come to mind is Altair's red and white suit. The plot is actually pretty good. The first leap of faith is nothing short of extraordinary. Altair himself. The game was a perfect introduction to the universe in terms of characters and story, but it was a touch broken when it came to combat and gameplay in general. Assassin's Creed 2, the fan favorite led by the uber charismatic Ezio, is one of those games you never forget. Set in breathtaking Renaissance Italy, it is the beginning of arguably one of the best trilogies in gaming. But even on its own, the game stands out. Gamers complained about how repetitive the original was, but no one in their right mind is going to complain about AC2 being repetitive. The game has you fly across Venice in a flying machine built by none other than Leonardo da Vinci. If that isn't a unique mission, I don't know what is. Assassin's Creed 2 is an example of an extraordinary game that doesn't have one particular extraordinary aspect. A likable protagonist, an amazing plot, good enough gameplay, a beautiful setting, and there you have the most loved Assassin's Creed. Brotherhood and Revelations were essentially AC2 with a few tweaks, but the games are what they are because of their stories. When we first meet Ezio, he is no more than a boy getting in trouble, but now he's a master assassin being compared with the legendary Altair. Over the course of the trilogy, we see him grow, empathize with him, and connect to him in a way we normally don't to a video game protagonist. Revelations takes you on an absolute roller coaster and finishes off on the highest of highs. On to Assassin's Creed 3, which is the end of Desmond's story, and for many this was the end of peak Assassin's Creed. But I think they did well for a few more years. You start off playing as a Templar, which is a nice twist, but the true hero of the story, Connor, is a very polarizing figure. He isn't a likable goof like Ezio was in AC2 or an honorable assassin like Altair. He is absolutely brutal. I mean, the way they have physically designed him represents that. He looks like a tank basically. But he wasn't as charismatic as his predecessors, and that was the main problem for a lot of people. The setting was great. I had no problems with the map at all. I loved the frontier section for some reason. The various little towns and cities were fascinating, but the games just didn't reach the level of the first few games. Now on to another fan favorite. Assassin's Creed Black Flag is almost universally loved. It plays out like a pirate's game. The main protagonist isn't even an assassin, but it still works. The truly gigantic world was the main focus here. Back in 2013, the ability to sail to any of the many islands and explore without any restrictions was fascinating. Even now it sounds mouth-watering. You go on treasure hunts, battle it with fierce predators, fight naval battles along with all the usual Assassin's Creed stuff that we have come to love. You can see why the game is remembered so fondly. Gameplay was a mixed bag though. At this point, the series had become counter and attack with combat. It was almost mind-numbing. Naval battles were fun. Stealth was as good as it ever had been. But some gameplay elements were starting to get dated. They went for another game with basically the same gameplay elements, same visual style, but set in the North Atlantic. Assassin's Creed Rogue was a pretty great game that got lost in between Unity's hype and Unity's letdown. You play as Shay Patrick, who is an assassin at the beginning of the game, turns Templar, and the idea is executed really well. Going after assassins is a nice change, and there were some nice gameplay changes that came with the idea. Enemies fought and moved like assassins, so it was a unique experience. It was a short experience, really underappreciated, and it even ties right into Unity. The ending of Rogue is the beginning of Unity, at least the prologue section where Arno is running around stealing apples. The time has finally come, an Assassin's Creed game that was more ambitious than anything we have gotten since. Unity was and is a diamond in the rough. Yeah, the game has texture pop-ins, NPCs spawn right in your face, but who cares? Arno is basically Ezio 2.0, maybe not as charismatic or likable, but they are pretty much identical in the beginning of the game. Just as we see Ezio grow and mature, we see Arno join the assassins and grow, but the game's greatness doesn't lie in its characters or the plot. It's just how much ahead of its time it was. Unity is one of the best looking games, period. When it runs like it's supposed to, it's downright stunning. The lighting here is just out of this world. This was the first year of the Xbox One PS4 era, and it took about 4 years until a game came out with a lighting engine like this. The parkour system had an option to parkour down a building, and there were so many new animations as well instead of the usual jump and climb. It looked cool, had a purpose, and is completely unique. No Creed game before Unity or since has had better parkour. Combat had a nice balance of challenge. If you manage to sneak around, play like an assassin, it's somewhat easy. But if you decide to take everyone on at the same time, there was little to no chance you'd survive. This made the game feel like an Assassin's Creed. As far as gameplay and graphics go, this was the perfect AC game. No matter how buggy it was, I have always loved the game. This is classic Assassin's Creed with ambitious ideas. Assassin's Creed Syndicate is a strange Creed game. It certainly isn't what Creed games are now, but it isn't like the earlier games either. Syndicate is set in 19th century London, making it the closest the series has gotten to our time, which is kind of cool, and the Victorian era is a cherry on top. Syndicate is different. Combat isn't focused on flawless kills. It's brutal, actually incredibly brutal. Fist fighting and grappling. These are tooth and nail brawls which are a far cry from what Assassin's Creed was. The grappling hook was literally taken from Batman. It is kind of a strange addition for a series that focuses on parkour. Why would you want to limit it? I have no clue, but it is what it is. The Victorian era brings a lot of technology with it. Guns, trains, fighting on running trains never gets old, be it Syndicate or Red Dead. I did like the new tone. I initially loved the combat. I have changed my opinion on that, but even so, Syndicate is a solid game. After Syndicate, Ubisoft took a year off and came up with Origins, going 2000 years back in time from Syndicate, which sounds so cool and terrifying and at the same time makes your life seem insignificant, doesn't it? But anyway, Origins is set in Egypt, but not ancient Egypt. It's set a little after that period because 2000 years isn't ancient enough, right? The game for the first time in the series went big with map size. This map is gigantic to say the least. But the problem for me is going anywhere on a horse or a camel is just boring. I mean, would you rather have a relatively small city like Unity with clusters of buildings to parkour and interact, or would you have a huge open world where exploration just feels dull? Unless your name starts with red and ends with redemption, horseback riding just isn't fun. Don't even get me started on them making Assassin's Creed an RPG. Like seriously, you couldn't come up with another IP to replicate The Witcher 3's success? A lot of people loved Origins and more power to them, but the game is just average in my humble opinion. Ubisoft went further back another 4 centuries from Origins to give us Odyssey, which might be the single smartest thing Ubisoft have ever done. They make a game called Assassin's Creed Origins and then go back another 400 years to give us another Assassin's Creed when there were no assassins. Just Ubisoft logic, I guess. Suffice to say, I didn't enjoy the game except for Ancient Greece, which was the only reason I played the game. Odyssey doubled down on RPG elements and made the series a full-fledged RPG, which is a bold move. Is it the right move? I seriously don't think so. But hey, at least they tried something new. Somehow they went out and outdid themselves with how much lower they could go. Valhalla has Vikings in it, but even that couldn't save the game. People were not even willing to complain. That's how much they were done with Assassin's Creed and Ubisoft. Other than the game world, which is once again absolutely extraordinarily beautiful, there isn't much to see. There's a newer style of Creed gameplay along with stealth elements. If you look at it, it is a fun game, but there's something so dull and stale about it that I don't think I'll ever replay it. The third franchise in the comparison is the oldest. It gave us its first game way back in 2004, but it wouldn't be until almost a decade later that the series became what it is now. I actually played Far Cry 2 before Far Cry 3. The game was actually really cool. Set in Africa, it was kind of weird for a FPS location, but I didn't know what Far Cry was about. Far Cry 2 was my introduction to the series. I didn't think much of the game, but it was a lot of fun. When I go back to it now, I feel the game is much better than what I initially thought. But this isn't the Far Cry we now know. I mean, the game is set in Africa, but it has no big cats, crocs, hippos, nothing. Only herbivores like Cape buffaloes and impalas. Contrast that to recent Far Cries where animals are a big part. The game isn't as goofy or silly either. It is also uncharacteristically challenging. You can literally die at any moment. It was part survival game as well in that regard. Perhaps Ubisoft's most acclaimed game ever, Far Cry 3, literally came out of nowhere and took over the world. I remember because at the same time Assassin's Creed 3 and Hitman Absolution came out, but Far Cry 3 completely overshadowed them. Vaas is arguably the greatest villain in a video game ever, and he wasn't even the main villain here. The beautiful yet disturbing Rook Islands, Vaas, the introduction of spooky stuff into Far Cry, and of course the fluid FPS mechanics that was so good, it has basically stayed the same 10 years later. The focus on stealth was also a welcome change. The only other good first-person game with stealth elements is Dishonored even now. The game came out in the tail end of the Xbox 360 era, but even still, it is a stunning game. On PC, the game looks as good as Far Cry 4, which is very impressive. But sadly, this was the last time Ubisoft took any real chances with the series. Yeah, Primal was a shot in the dark, but it isn't even considered a main entry in the series. Far Cry 4 had a seemingly crazy villain, just like the third game, but there are quite a few twists. Kyrat is a dream setting, but I really didn't have as much fun exploring as I thought I would. Everything apart from the location feels the same from Far Cry 3. You sneak around liberating outposts, the antagonist, Pagan Min pops up here and there to give a speech, you get told what to do at the beginning of every mission, and there's a bit of freedom in who you decide to side with, and it certainly doesn't help that the game just looks dated. It came out in the same month as Unity and it just looks dead average. A solid entry but a pretty stale one too. Primal was not the brightest of ideas, and this is coming from a huge prehistoric era nut. The age-old question, why wouldn't Ubisoft just create another new IP for their unique idea, comes up again. There's literally no reason this needed to be a Far Cry game. In fact, being a Far Cry definitely holds it back. And on top of that, why would you make a first-person shooter when there was nothing to shoot with? Seeing ancient creatures like the saber-tooth in a game was definitely worth it though. Far Cry 5 is a game that I love. Maybe it was because I just didn't have high hopes. The very first cutscene pulls you in just like Far Cry 3. I love the tonal shift. It's still wacky, goofy and silly at times, but it is toned down. The protagonist, the deputy, was the only major problem I had with the game. Having a mute protagonist in a story-driven game that lasts for dozens of hours is a bad idea. The game world and world design was fantastic with a lot of diversity. Each area felt distinct and different. The antagonist was very good even though most of the time he's spitting out mumbo jumbo. Which brings us to the last game, Far Cry 6. Every Far Cry since 3 has tried to be Far Cry 3, but at least they try to hide the fact. But not Far Cry 6. It is a blatant rip-off of Far Cry 3 and it doesn't even try to hide it. Complete with a tropical island and actors from the Breaking Bad universe. This is the biggest Far Cry map, and before its release, I was actually hyped up. The game looked very promising. In the end, what we got was a good enough game, but it's just the same. I didn't even bother with the side stuff. The main missions felt repetitive. I seriously don't even want to know the state of side missions. For me, Assassin's Creed is Ubisoft's best IP and franchise, and it'll always be Ubisoft's best, unless they keep making Assassin's Creed and completely destroy its legacy. The series has had so many great games. AC2, AC1 even, Black Flag, Unity, Origins and 3 were solid too. And only one game has been truly average, and that was Valhalla. I would love to know your pick, comment down below, subscribe to the channel while you're down there. If you really like the video, consider the super thanks option. It's a way of showing your support with a small tip. If you can't, it's no problem at all. Thanks for watching and have a great day wherever you are.